There is a moment after the connection fades when the silence feels heavier than the breakup itself. Not because the relationship ended, but because of how suddenly everything changed. One day, conversation feels natural, familiar, almost effortless. The next day, something shifts. The warmth that once felt steady becomes distant. Messages slow down. The tone feels different. And without warning, the closeness you trusted turns into quiet space you do not understand. What makes this phase so unsettling is not just the absence of contact, but the contrast between what was shared and what now feels missing. You remember the moments that once felt secure, late conversations, inside jokes, plans that felt real. Those memories still feel alive in your mind, yet their presence in your life disappears without explanation. That gap between memory and reality creates confusion. It begins to feel unnatural, almost unreal, as if something meaningful was removed without closure. You start questioning small details, replaying conversations, searching for signs you may have missed. The silence does not just create distance, it creates doubt. And in that doubt, the emotional shock of disappearance begins to settle in. What many people misunderstand about emotional withdrawal is that it rarely happens without reason. When someone with avoidant tendencies begins to pull back, it can feel sudden and confusing from the outside. But internally, that distancing is often tied to patterns that were formed long before the relationship began. For many avoidants, closeness does not automatically feel safe. At some point in their early experiences, relying on others may have felt unpredictable or overwhelming. Over time, independence became more than a preference, it became protection. Emotional distance turned into a way to stay in control and avoid feeling vulnerable. So when intimacy starts to deepen, something subtle begins to shift inside them. The connection may still matter, and the feelings may still exist, but the growing closeness can trigger discomfort rather than comfort. Not because the relationship is failing, but because emotional depth starts to feel risky. Vulnerability requires trust, and trust requires surrendering some control. For someone who learned to depend only on themselves, that surrender can feel threatening. This is why distancing often happens before the sense of loss is fully felt. The withdrawal is not always about losing interest or forgetting the connection. It is often a protective reaction to emotional intensity. As the bond strengthens, their system looks for ways to reduce pressure, creating space to restore a sense of safety. From the outside, this can look cold or indifferent. It may seem like they stopped caring without warning. But in many cases, the distancing is less about the absence of feeling and more about managing discomfort. Understanding this difference changes how withdrawal is interpreted. It reveals that detachment is often a defense, not a disappearance of emotion. After the distance is created, there is often a phase that feels especially confusing to witness. This is the stage where they appear calm, steady, and surprisingly unaffected. While you may still be processing the shock and emotional fallout, they seem focused, productive, and even comfortable with the separation. From the outside, it can look like they moved forward without hesitation, as if the connection did not leave the same impact. This phase is often misunderstood as closure, but in many cases, it is something very different. The calm you see is not always the result of emotional resolution. Instead, it can come from the sudden reduction of pressure. When emotional intensity fades, the nervous system experiences relief. The expectations, vulnerability, and depth that once felt overwhelming are no longer present, and that absence can feel temporarily stabilizing. For the person left behind, this contrast feels deeply unfair. While you are facing the weight of loss, they appear to be functioning normally, sometimes even thriving. You may notice them filling their time with work, social activity, or new routines. They may look composed, confident, and unaffected by the shift that feels so heavy to you. That visible stability can create painful questions. You may begin to wonder whether the connection mattered equally, or whether the relationship held the same meaning on both sides. But what appears to be progress is often only distance from discomfort. Relief does not equal healing. Feeling lighter after separation does not mean the emotions were fully processed. It often means the intensity was removed before the deeper feelings had a chance to surface. And that temporary ease can create the illusion of moving on, even when the emotional story is far from finished. After the phase of relief settles, something quieter begins to form beneath the surface. It is not loud or dramatic, and that is why most people never notice it. On the outside, life continues as usual. Schedules remain full, routines stay structured, and distractions become part of daily life. Everything appears controlled and stable, but internally, tension begins to collect in ways that are easy to ignore at first. Busyness becomes a powerful tool during this stage. Work, social activity, entertainment, and constant movement create distance from reflection. When the day is packed with responsibilities and noise, there is little room left for uncomfortable thoughts. It can feel productive and even empowering to stay occupied, as if moving forward proves that everything is under control. But distraction does not erase emotion. It only postpones it. Feelings that are not processed do not disappear. They wait. They remain stored beneath attention, slowly gathering weight over time. Each memory that is pushed aside, each thought that is avoided, adds another layer to the pressure building internally. What makes this stage important is how subtle it feels. There are no obvious signs at first, just brief moments of pause that pass quickly. A memory might surface unexpectedly, then be buried again under activity. A quiet moment may feel slightly uncomfortable, then be replaced with noise or routine. Yet this quiet accumulation creates anticipation. Suppressed emotions do not stay silent forever. Over time, the tension grows strong enough to demand attention. And when that moment arrives, it does not feel sudden. It feels overdue, like something that has been waiting patiently beneath the surface all along. There comes a point when the distance has lasted long enough that something begins to shift internally, not suddenly and not in a dramatic way, but quietly. This is the moment when reflection starts to replace distraction. The routine that once kept everything manageable no longer feels as effective, and thoughts that were pushed aside begin returning with more persistence. What makes this stage different is how memories start to change in tone. In the beginning, it was easier to focus on what felt overwhelming: misunderstandings, emotional pressure, or moments that justified stepping away. That focus created a sense of certainty, a story that made distance feel necessary. But with time, emotional intensity fades, and conflict loses its sharpness. Without daily tension, the mind begins to remember the connection differently. Moments that once felt heavy now appear softer. Small gestures, shared laughter, and familiar routines start resurfacing in a new light. The emotional distance removes the urgency that once dominated attention, allowing space for a more balanced view of what was shared. This is where the internal narrative begins to weaken. Justification slowly gives way to uncertainty. Instead of repeating reasons for leaving, new questions begin to form. Was the distance truly necessary? Was something meaningful left unresolved? These questions do not arrive with clear answers. They appear quietly, often in moments of stillness, when there is nothing left to distract the mind. That shift from certainty to questioning marks a psychological turning point. It signals that the protective story is losing strength. Reflection begins to replace defense, and once questioning starts, it becomes difficult to return to the certainty that once made separation feel simple. There is a moment in this process that changes everything. It does not arrive with noise or sudden drama, but when it happens, it becomes impossible to ignore. This is the true point of no return, the stage where the internal pressure that has been building quietly becomes stronger than the instinct to avoid emotion. Up until this point, distance may have felt manageable. Distractions worked. Justifications felt convincing. It was easier to stay focused on routines and responsibilities rather than sit with uncomfortable thoughts. But over time, the pressure created by unprocessed emotion grows heavier. Memories surface more often. Moments of stillness feel less comfortable. What was once easy to ignore begins demanding attention. At this stage, denial starts to lose its strength. The explanations that once felt solid begin to feel incomplete. Instead of pushing thoughts away, they linger. A familiar memory might return and stay longer than expected. A reminder of the connection may create a feeling that cannot be dismissed as easily as before. The emotional distance that once provided relief now begins to feel like absence. This is where recognition of loss becomes unavoidable. Not just as an idea, but as an emotional reality. The mind can no longer fully protect itself with logic or distraction. There is a growing awareness that something meaningful existed, and that its absence carries weight. Once this realization settles in, returning to complete detachment becomes difficult. The wall that once felt solid begins to crack. Avoidance no longer feels like control, it feels like distance from something that mattered. And that shift marks the true turning point, where denial weakens and emotional truth begins to take its place. At a certain point in this journey, the focus naturally begins to shift. It is no longer about decoding their silence, or predicting their emotions, or waiting for signs of realization. The attention slowly turns inward. This is where real transformation begins, not in what they feel, but in how you respond to what happened. Emotional restraint becomes the first sign of this shift. Instead of reacting impulsively to absence or uncertainty, there is a pause. That pause creates space for clarity. It allows emotion to exist without control. And in that space, something important develops: self-respect. You stop reaching for closure from someone who could not offer consistency. You stop explaining your worth to someone who did not recognize it in real time. Growth does not always feel powerful in the beginning. Sometimes it feels like silence, like distance, like choosing not to engage with what once pulled you in emotionally. But over time, that silence becomes stability. That distance becomes clarity. And that clarity becomes strength. What changes everything is the realization that your outcome is no longer dependent on their awareness. Whether they return or not, your direction does not shift. Because your value was never meant to be confirmed through their recognition. It was always present, even when it was overlooked. Emotional maturity is built in moments like this, when you choose yourself without needing validation, when you understand that attachment does not require sacrifice of self-worth, when you stop shrinking your emotions just to maintain access to someone who could not hold your depth. And in that state, something powerful happens. The story no longer revolves around loss. It becomes about evolution. Not who left, not who stayed, but who you became in the process.